Hey, how's it going? Welcome to the Watercolor Studio here at the barn. Where's the Watercolor Studio? It's wherever you want it to be. Right now we're in the print and bookmaking studio set up here to cover down on some basic watercolor techniques. So during our classes for watercolor techniques, we hand out a small basic watercolor techniques card. And you can see watercolor techniques many places. It's taught basically everywhere. This one is a small one to be able to kind of get you in the feel of it. But what I wanted to be able to talk to you about today was why we're doing each one of these. There's a lot of people that can tell you, hey, this is what it is. This is what we call it. This is wet on dry. This is wet on wet. But why are we actually looking at practicing each one of these? Why do professional artists still come back to these watercolor techniques? And that's what we're going to get into. So, hey, number one is the basic watercolor techniques card. The first one we're going to look at is wet on dry, which is this top left one. We'll find a nice color. So your wet on dry is the absolute basic watercolor technique. It is putting paint onto paper. So we'll start out with, I've got a Viridian here, which is a green blue. So what I'm doing here, not just putting wet on dry, I'm mixing the color. I'm taking it out of the pan, putting it onto a palette, and I can use different palettes. I've got this small one here. And then I'm mixing it with water to some consistency. So the consistency I want to use for this first one, just to put wet on dry, is about 50%, 40 to 50% paint to water. So I've got about 50 to 60% water and then paint. Well, I'm also looking at, when you're doing wet on dry, you're thinking about your brush. So how large is your brush? How much water is it going to take in? Each one of these things, as you start to work through, you're able to figure out a little bit more about the watercolor. And a lot of this is water control, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But like I said, wet on dry, putting wet paint onto dry paper in some format. Pretty simple, and we can move over to the large one. And with wet on dry, you can start to work on different brush strokes. If you apply more pressure with the brush, it's going to leave a larger mark. If the brush starts running out of paint, then you're going to get a little bit of dry brush technique, and we've got that coming up. But each one of these for wet on dry is when you're putting wet paint on dry paper, is going to help you identify how your colors mix, how your brushes react with that, and each one of the paper, how they're going to work together. So that's wet on dry. The next one is wet on wet. And there's a couple of different ways to do this. Again, no one way in watercolor to do anything. But wet on wet is putting wet paint into an already wet area. First way to do that is just simply by pre-wetting the paper. So if we pre-wet the paper with clear water, and then we come back, and I'll take a blue, so hopefully that shows up, cerulean blue, and we drop the paint into the paper on the edge or in the middle. It's going to bloom out, and so you're dropping wet into wet. We'll move to the larger page. Again, same technique. Didn't clear the brush quite as well, but still going to get us there. So basically clear water, a little bit of blue tint there. But if I come back and drop more pigmented into that, it's going to give me nice soft edges as the watercolor blooms out, instead of the hard edges that we've got for the wet on dry. The same way wet on wet is you can use the same color or multiple colors. If I wanted to come back in with the same color and work that down, I can work that down wet into wet. Or we'll take our blue-green, we can drop that directly wet in wet, or we can come up and we can touch it. So we'll drop it in first, and then work that down and let that mix on its own. You can mix it a little bit, but the watercolor capillary action will bloom right into it. So that's working its way down from there. We can also work our way up. So if we want to come back and put, let's say, a blue back into that green, We can work our way up for a softer transition. This wet starts to touch into the wet there. And you've got the mix on the other side as well. So that's wet on wet. The next one we're going to look at is a flat wash. For covering large areas, flat wash is your basic. It is what you're trying to achieve is a single color and a single hue and value throughout the whole different technique or the different area that you're going to look at. We'll pick up, it's kind of an olive green. It's got a different name, but a nice olive green here to start out with. And I want to mix this and enough to be able to cover the area that I want to mix so that I'm not having to go back into the paint pan, because every time you do that, your mix might be slightly different. If we want a flat wash, we want it all to be the same. So once I have enough of my mix within my palette, I'm going to check my brush for any loose stray hairs. Come back in. I'm not going to dip it back into the water, because that's going to add more water each time. I'm just going to work its way down and keep a wet edge on the bottom and pick up more paint to keep the same amount of paint, but to work it all the way down, and now you've got one color on a flat wash. There you go. There's a flat wash. That'll dry a little bit. If you come back in and fidget with it, you're going to start to get some blooms, which can be absolutely beautiful. But if you just want the flat wash, now we've got to take patience and let it dry a little bit. Next one is we've kind of already looked at it, but it's another wet on wet technique, but it's dropping color wet and wet. So we'll start with an orange this time. So I'm going to go wet on dry first to get paint down, in a flattish wash type of function. And now what I'm going to do is come back with a second color, this time red. I'm going to drop it in the bottom right, wet on wet, but it's dropping that color in. Just touching that color in. I want to pick up a little bit more. Touching the color in and letting it blend in a little bit on its own, blending it a little bit so that you've got it there. Similar to what we did with touching in the wet on wet. Dropping in a wet on wet, and we'll look at a larger sample here, is going to give us more of those soft edges. So I want it wet enough that it's shiny, still shiny. That's how you can tell it's still wet, but I don't want it puddled on there. Puddled water will dilute the pigments a little bit much, so it's going to come up lighter, as well as it might run on you a little bit in ways that you don't exactly want. Come back into, again, one of my reds. And I'll come with a thick drop on that bottom right and let that just blend in. We'll do that on the bottom, but to be able to really let you see it, we will go in with a blue on the top, which is going to neutralize it a little bit, but not a problem. So you can see how when we're just dropping the wet and wet, that it blooms out. And then we'll just let it go. We can use this to add dimension, depth, and texture to some of the paintings that we do. Next one is a value scale. Now this one is one we're gonna sit on for just a little bit. Again, I want to use a color that's visible to you. So I'm gonna go with purple on this one. Dioxazine purple, we'll drop that in. Actually, I'll go dioxazine violet. There we go. So what we're looking to do with a graded wash is basically create a value scale. Throughout that, we want to work from no paint all the way up to straight out of the pan 100%. So I do percentages. Some people look at it on strength. So if you're looking at the strength of coffee, the strength of tea, the strength of milk, or that consistency is kind of what we're looking for here. So the first one is 0% paint, 100% water. We'll start with, and it's just going to be water there. So we'll work wet and wet and touching that and moving it up. The next one I want anywhere from 10 to 20% paint, so I'm going to water down this paint a little bit more. In this area, work about the 10 to 20. Now I want to go to, let's say about a 20 to 30%. So I'll pick up a little bit more paint. So now we're moving from tea to kind of a coffee area. And work that right in, next one up. Pick up a little bit more paint. Bring that back into your palette. Now it's about I'm going to go for about a 50% mix right there. Again, working up in, we're going to go 2 more steps. This one's going to get to 70 to 80%. Nice and dark. And the final one is we're going to come almost directly out of the pan, so it's pretty much all pigment. Drop that pigment right in, all the way there. We use this for swatches. We can use this to combine colors at different times. And it's good to understand these practices allow us to see how much strength that we want per each one. Another way to do this when you're doing a swatch is to lay down heavy paint first. So that would be our 100%. I'm going to drop a little bit more wet and wet on that on top. My wet edge I want to keep on this bottom, which means the wet edge of the paint so it doesn't create these hard lines. And I'm just going to start dipping in a little bit of water, clearing the brush a little bit more water going wet and wet, and then just dragging that down. And we can see a much more graded scale as we work all the way down. As the paint and water continue to mix, coming all the way down to the lightest tones that we can achieve with this color. Again, great way to do it, and you can see on each of my pan sets, that's basically what I've done in a small area to help me understand which colors when I'm looking for them. So that's our graded wash. Dry brush, a lot of fun. You need a little bit of tooth to your paper, so if you're working with a very smooth paper, it's not going to be quite as apparent. But a dry brush is working the brush, completely drying it off after it's clean, coming back into a color, and we'll come back into our Viridian here, and just picking up a little bit of paint. Dry brush, you put the paint down and then you let it run out. And I've got too much there. I'm going to dry it off a little bit. And there you start to get some streaks, and it just picks up on some of the tooth or the texture of the paper. And I'm going to do a larger swatch so we can see. I'm going to actually pick up a square brush for this. Again, coming back into that Viridian. Make sure I have enough paint in the palette, but then dry my brush, and only not fully saturating the brush. Pick up a little bit and dry brush down. Those are the areas that it's just picked up, and dry brush. This can be used again for making texture. This is great for water. If we went back into some of the blue, and again, this is quite a blue for a water. But if we were making water, or possibly texture on the bottom of feathers, if we're doing other different animals or plants, to be able to put some of that texture in. And dry brush is a lot of the white of the paper showing through. Good to practice this with each different brush, because each different brush is going to pick up different amounts of paint, and it'll take you longer or shorter depending on how much you pick up to be able to get the effect that you want. Next one is a hard edge and a soft edge, and we've already done this before, which is nice. So what we're actually talking about is the edges of the paint. So when we look at wet on dry, or when we look at the edges of the wet on wets, those are going to give us hard edges. When we don't wash and smooth out all of the paint to a more graded value all the way at the bottom, all those different edges are going to be your hard edges. These can define things, but sometimes they show up in places we don't want. In those instances, we're going to want more of a soft edge, and we see the soft edge already as we drop wet and wet. So a hard edge is typically at the edge of a wet on wet, or just a wet on dry, that we come down and we make sure not to blend in with clear water, and that you've got a hard edge there. Soft edges can be done within wet and wet, or if you're doing a single color, wet on dry, is doing basically that graded scale again. Clear your brush off, come back into some clear water, and then just work that edge until it disappears so it softens out. So that's our soft edge. Blending of colors is another wet and wet technique, or as we do two wet and dry and we're letting two colors touch. So we can blend these on the palette. So I can add in a red to a purple to make it much more of a reddish purple. And blend it there so there's a much more red purple. Or we can go directly into our purple, place that on the page, and then come back in red and drop it wet and wet, or bring it in just to those areas and get a similar effect. Each one of these are going to be different, and blends can be also be done after the paint is dried on the paper. So if we've got some, and I'll use the graded scale a little bit, even though it's still a little bit wet. But if we've got an undercolor of purple already there, we can come back over it with the red and get something also similar. Come back in and do a wash over top to find that we've got similar colors. Now this one's a little bit more red because I went into the lighter area, so let's go into the darker area then. There we go. I don't want to put too much water down to reactivate the paint. Otherwise, I'm going to mix it, scrub it in, and it's going to turn out a little bit muddy. But now we've got similar colors through 3 different ways on that blend. All right, so that's most of the putting paint down and seeing what happens. But there's so many other techniques out there. I want to go through a couple of them that you could use within our classes in your own paintings and checking out. The first one is scratching. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to put some type of a dent into the paper. What that allows is the water to flow in, and when the water flows in, it's also going to flow pigment into that area. When you get more pigment into an area, it's going to become darker. We can use this for edging. You can also use it to try to control some of the areas and some of the water. Instead of putting a hard edge in there, you can put a scratch. Again, we're going to look at one of our darker colors. We'll come back in with a nice indigo on this. And scratching, even though we start out relatively light on the page, once you come back in, and you can use a credit card, you can use the end of a pencil, you can use the end of your paintbrush, you can use your fingernail. But when you scratch it, and what I'm going to do again with the back end of this is put a dent in there, and you can immediately see how dark that starts to get. We're going to do a big one over here. Same thing. Light indigo flat wash is what we're going for. Now I'm not mixing it in the pan, so I've got to be real careful and try to get the same mix if I wanted a true flat wash. But relatively light in the, for that paint color. We come back in, and again, maybe with a fingernail, maybe with the back of a pencil, maybe we're giving some texture in there, maybe some circles, but those, almost like a scratch board, immediately show up within that area. Blotting's another good one. This is a lifting technique. We'll start off by putting down, let's go for a turquoise. We'll do the copper blue. It should show up well enough. So we're going to put this copper blue down. But let's say on decent paper, so we'll talk about paper in the next video. But with a mid-graded professional paper, you've got a little bit of time to be able to pick that up. A lot of times you're going to do it with a towel or a paper towel. Make sure it's clean, otherwise you're going to mix colors. I've gotten into trouble doing that before. But you can just blot those areas and pick that up for a little bit of lighter color. This is used a lot of times in skies. So let's flip our paper really quick. Let's do a quick sky scene. I wanted to do cerulean, but it's a little light, and I want to put down paint pretty quick, so I'm going to go with a larger brush. We'll use that same color. Let's put a nice quick sky up here. A lot of times skies, pro tip is put a little warm in the bottom of it as it goes down. And because I know if I'm going to put clouds over in this area and my light's coming from the left side, I know it's going to be a little darker on the right. So I can actually put wet and wet, a little bit of the darker color over there. Doesn't look like clouds yet, but that's because we are going to lift some of that paint up. Come back in, clean area. We're going to just blot that down. Maybe there's a little bit there. And then drop those clouds by picking it back up. This picks the paint back up almost completely. But again, you've still got some light shades and some texture moving through there. Again, most of the times we'd want to come back and start highlighting those clouds probably after it's dried. But coming back within those areas and starting to identify those would be a full technique, but blotting, being able to pick that up. Same way it can be done. Let's use kind of a gray or a darker color. If we've got a nice gray day out there and maybe the sun is just coming through the clouds, or maybe it's back in a sunset, we can put the clouds in later. But another way to lift as that dries a little bit is coming back just with a brush and to blot that up with a dry brush and lift. You can add a little bit of clear water, let that soak in, reactivate the paint to be able to lift that up. And that's a little bit light, so it's kind of tough to see. Let me come back with a little bit harder and a little bit deeper value there. So we'll come back over, there we go. Deeper value, pretty wet though, still shiny, so I know that it's wet. And we'll do that one more time. Just lifting it up. Maybe the sun's coming through there. Maybe there's some rays coming down. Each time I'm picking up the paint, I have to get rid of it also, otherwise I'm just going to move paint around. And so it's a little bit softer rather than if we had just blotted. Find a clean spot. A circle there. And wasn't very careful about that, but we can cover that down. So a little bit different way to do the lifting there. So that's the blotting as well as lifting, whether that's with a paper towel or with a brush. So those are our basic techniques and the basic watercolor techniques that we look at. So pretty fun, but let's see what advanced techniques we can do as well. As we start to work towards the advanced techniques, we start to use different materials. And this is a card I did up already a little bit. One of the ones is bubble wrap. So if you put a flat wash down, we've already got a flat wash that's relatively still wet a little bit. You can drop some type of a bubble wrap. And what's that's doing, it's providing a resist and picking up some paint. And so as you pick it up, you're going to get a different texture. These textures can be used for background. It can be used for some of the greenery. And different bubble wraps will give you different ones. Cellophane is one that I like, especially a lot of people use this for rocks. They use it for cliff sides, rocks. But let's say we've got kind of a rock shape there. And then crumple up the cellophane a little bit and press that down into it, not hard, just making sure that it has contact. And you can let it dry, or you can lift it up early. And those ways you can start to get a lot of texture in there. River rocks on the bottom, similar to here, and you can go back in and then highlight with a detail brush. Maybe some of the other areas of those rocks and pull them out, but it gives you a fun texture with a resist. Other ways to do it are salt. So and it depends on the coarseness of the salt. I've already done a salt here, but if you drop salt, salt's gonna, again, lift the paint and give you a texture. They use this for the underside of wings, backgrounds, meadows, something that you want to put texture into that might not be there with a regular flat wash. You have to let that dry fully and then brush it off, and you end up getting these snowflake-like patterns within the salt for some of the finer salt. But flake salt's going to be different, rock salt's going to be different. The next one to do is we got a little bit of alcohol here. So if you mix other things or drop other fluids like salt water or an alcohol into the paint while it's still wet on wet, you can get some really interesting effects. I'm going to try to go way green because this one, sometimes it's called a tie-dye effect. I'm going to get, this is a phthalo light green, aka super bright, and I'm going to really get a good spot in there while it's still wet on wet. I usually take a clean brush for this, but a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, just like you're going to drop clear water into it, just dropping that in. Do a little bit of splatter, and you can see that the alcohol resists the paint, pushes it out, but then starts mixing with the paint as well and gives you some really interesting effects. Other masks are simply taping it off. So if I utilize tape, masking fluid, white colored pencils, as well as even rubber cement. Something useful to be able to stop the paint getting to the paper, can leave white spaces for you or preserve colors that you want to preserve without you having to go around them. So there we go. There's some of our advanced techniques. We got one more to go through. Let me clear this out of the way and kind of go from there. Third techniques I wanted to show you, we're going to work off of a small bird sketch that I've done. So the first one is, you'll see watercolor artists that they move their painting around. I usually work on about a 15-degree tilt or sometimes down flat. Once you work on a tilt, I allow some of those wet edges, and I've got lighter up top, and those pigments will start to merge down for me. So depending on angles and tilting, and we're going to look at that as techniques. The first thing we're going to do is actually look at how tilting can help manage that. I'm going to come back into a nice orange. I'm going to knock it down a little bit, which we'll talk about here just right after that. So knock that orange down just a little bit, neutralize it out. Come back in, wet on dry, and then I'm gonna clear through some of those hard edges and bring some of them out soft. I want a couple of hard edges and a couple of soft edges. But if we keep adding paint in areas, I can have that flow down just by tilting. And I'll show you in just a minute. And we can even have it drip down. So if I put enough water on here, we can have some drips coming off that might give a little bit of life, might give a little bit of interest to the painting. Same way in doing that, we can come back over top with some of the blues and their back feathers. And we can work some splatter in there. You can do this with toothbrushes. They usually go all over the place. I'll either usually load up a brush with paint and then tap it with my finger or tap it over one of my fingers to throw some splatter on there. The next one's kind of fun. I'll do two different demonstrations of this, but we'll work on the tail feather on this one. I'm going to pick up some darker blue. And I'm going to put a decent size puddle. And this one I actually am going to puddle there, because you can tilt and use air to blow that out and give some different looks to some of the paintings. Some of these are fun with floral. So if we come back with, let's say, a sap green, drop back into my water, activate, meaning putting water onto that sap green. Again, I want a larger amount of paint here so that it's going to move for me. And maybe just some quick leaves down below. We usually shadow these in or something else, but this is just a technique to see what we can do here. Instead of, I'm going to use a tool here. It is a soda straw. And try to work some of this paint out to make a larger flower head. I'll drop a little bit more paint because I want a couple more rays out coming there. Go wet, back wet into wet. Come back in. And there we go. Kind of got a spider plant going on. Maybe we'll come back in with a little bit of light red, maybe my ruby. And just at the ends, maybe that's where the flowers live. There you go. So we've controlled it a little bit, but allowed the watercolor to follow some of the lines and the edges. You can come back in and put some more in there, but moving, whether it's through tilting, whether it's through using air or some of the drips or splatter painting, might be a way to, another technique to be able to bring some difference to some of your paintings. We are going to set up color mixing. So these are techniques, and we want to know how to mix colors, but one specific one that I wanted to touch base with on this video was neutral mixing. So neutrals are simply grays. They're darker shades. Watercolors mix a little bit differently than other mediums do. So for watercolors, if we add in all of the colors or all the primary colors, if we're red, blue, and yellow in this case, it's going to create a neutral or a gray. So we've already got orange here on the palette, and now we've already got blue. So red and yellow. If I bring a little bit of blue in there, it neutralizes it or starts to make a gray. And we can do this. This is why also in the classes we hand out, make sure that everybody has a color wheel as I flick paint all over everything. A color wheel to see which colors are opposite each other to create those neutrals. So each one of these, my favorite to do is blue and orange, which I just did. So if we take a blue and then we take one of these deeper oranges and mix that together, we get a nice gray. I like doing that because a lot of my shadows I like to make blue, so to add in a little bit more color, I can just come back in and drop in maybe a little bit more blue to cool that down a little bit. But other ways to do it, purple and yellow. So I've got a nice green gold, aka gold over here. And we've already got a purple on our palette, so I'll put the gold down first and I'll mix on the page. But as those mix together, I'll pick up a little bit more of that dioxazine purple. It's going to neutralize out and give us a gray color. How about, let's look at red and green. Come back in with our sap green. and then put in a crimson into it. More of a red shadow, so a little bit lighter here, more of a red. If you look at each one of these individually, they're pretty gray, but if you look at them across the board together, they're a whole lot of fun. They can give you different looks and different shadows with what you're trying to do. And we'll look at that because there's 3 different ways to do shadows also. Another one of the techniques that we often practice in figuring out our colors and working to mix these neutrals is we'll paint spheres. Hey, you can do cubes, you can do whatever you want. Spheres are fun for me. First shadow color we can do is just a straight gray or black. Now we're going to do blue. No, I lied. We'll go with it. We'll start with a blue sphere. We want to work that darker to the bottom. More water means lighter, so there. And if we wanted to, I'm going to lift a little bit on the top, bring that back down. One of the ways to do that is just using a gray or black on the bottom and indicating this is the bottom of the ball. Sometimes this doesn't look quite as natural as other times if you're using it within petals, within flora, within fauna, even with people or something. Some of the subjects or buildings that you're looking at, because there's so much light coming out. A lot of times, just adding in a black doesn't exactly work. Another way to do it is just using jewel tones. Again, painting the sphere, very similar way. But now we're going to give it some sort of a jewel tone. I'm going to drop purple. So a similar color, but dropping purple, wet and wet, to give it that shadow. A different look, it's brighter. And depending on how you want to paint, good things, but again, technique's good things to practice. We can also just simply do a darker value. So a darker value is using the same paint and just making sure that, so clear that up top, get the same light from the left, pick up a little bit more as we work that sphere, but then come back with almost 100% straight out of the pan and make that really dark on that edge. Same color, just darker, to tell you that that is the shaded part. The pro tip for shading, and a lot of times in ways that allow it to look quite natural, is utilizing the contrasting color. So we look at the color wheel. We've already done this once, but we know blue contrasting color is going to be orange. Paint the sphere the same way. Add some water to the top. This is where our light's coming from. A little bit more paint on the bottom. Had to lift. I put a little much on top. There we go. That's similar to all the others. But now we just want to neutralize some of this blue. This can be done with underpainting. I'm going wet into wet. And I'm going to come back with just this orange. In the same way, show you that this shadow, and it goes down orange and you think it's going to be really bright, but as those watercolors merge together, it neutralizes that out and gives you a really, really clean contrasting color with a little pop in there. So those are the 4 ways to do shadows, contrasting colors, as well as mixing our neutrals. All right, last fun stuff. Got a couple of fly agarics here. Same sketch, we're going to do it in a little bit different way. This is also utilizing brushes. I typically use a round brush, but the marks you make on the paper start to define your style, how you paint, and what the paint's going to do for you. So we're going to use a flat brush on the left, and we're going to use round brush on the right. Same paper, same paints. We'll just see how each one of them come out, and if you can see any differences or see some of the things that you'd like to do. We'll start with the top. We'll come in with nice deep red. I'm going to go scarlet red on this one. And some of those edges. Use a little green to that contrasting color for the bottom there for the shadow. And then I want to bring in some orange again to lighten it up because the light's coming from the right side. As that dries, we'll be able to come back in underneath that here in a minute, but right now I'm going to do the stem, again with the flat brush. Coming back in with, basically it's a light tan. And the flat brush, you can use the edges. It's got a little bit of dry brush in there, but putting that in, and I want to utilize probably a brown and a black to give you some of the dirt down here. Nice, just really quick. But so with the flat brush, I start to get some of the edges, and again, depending on the size of your painting that you're doing and what you'd like to do, is going to give you different marks. We'll do the same thing. It's going to look similar, but a little bit different. Just using the round brush. Again, using wet on dry, using wet on wet techniques, thinking about my water control, planned out how I want to probably move through this painting and make each one. Coming back in with my orange. Now working down the stem. And again, we'd usually let this dry, clear out the brushes a little bit, but we're having way too much fun, so we're just gonna keep going. And you see I'm having to pick up more paint with the round brush because the flat brush holds more paint. So that's one of the things on the way you paint that could leave me with more hard edges. Maybe I want that, maybe I don't. And the brush strokes on the bottom are going to be smaller and a little bit different with the round brush that I use. Soften that up just a little bit. So relatively the same, but practicing your techniques with each of your type of brushes that you want to use is going to give you slightly different results to be able to get there. We'll leave those as is right now and finalize out using these same images with some of the other stuff that we can do. That includes pen and ink. So a lot of modern watercolor is using mixed media, and that's phenomenal. Finding new ways to highlight areas or utilize them. Gel pens are an option, as well as coming back through on top or in the first layers, putting down pen and ink. We've got different sizes here that we can use to highlight that. They don't have to be done with fine liners. You can also use dip pens and ink bottles. So got a silver here that I've shook up, and a dip pen if we want to do some highlights within those areas. Those can also be done just with regular gel pens, which are water-based as well. And some of the gel pens are fun, like white. You can come back in. Now this is still too wet. I don't want to let this dry fully, but we'll see if we can get some white down within those areas to show you that we can pick back up. If you didn't want to work around those or use a masking fluid, you can come back in with whether it's gouache, whether it's acrylic, whether it's a gel pen, to be able to make the painting your own and make it look like you want to show other people. This is the painting that I want to show to others. So those are the techniques. We started out with basic watercolor techniques with wet on dry, wet on wet, getting those flat washes in there as well as graded washes, dropping color wet and wet, and then seeing how they were able to change hard edges, soft edges, what those look like, so that we're all talking the same terminology, and why we're practicing each one of these for water control, what your paint mix is, what each one of your colors is going to do, because the way they mix colors is going to be different. Some of them granulate, some of them don't like to mix with each other, some of them mix extremely well. And then we went on to different things that we can also do with the paint: scratching, blotting. We looked at making a little bit of a cloud scene. We lifted, we put some salt down, as well as utilizing other different materials to resist paint and to be able to give us different textures within that. Then we worked down super advanced techniques to getting some splatter on there, making this bird really come to life, at least the start of it, to give it some dynamic action within a two-dimensional painting. And then we also looked at the brush strokes, pen and ink, all the different things you can do. I want to thank you for visiting the Watercolor Studio, and looking forward to seeing you in the workshops. I'm Caleb Tucker. Enjoy yourself.